thank you very much, everybody, for staying so late. It's a dedication, commitment to the field, commitment to colleagues. Thank you so much. Lovely to see you all here. This panel is on how grassroots innovations travel. And essentially the idea here is to hear from practitioners from very different contexts, and essentially that question of who at the local level translates what transitional justice means, what transitional justice should mean, what transitional justice can mean differently from what is conventionally understood. So we're talking here with a diverse group of people, and let me firstly say we have men and women. The reason why the three men in the middle is because these are assigned seats. As you will see from behind me, this was decided for us. Blame someone else, not the men sitting here. Just to introduce myself first, I'm Hugo van der Merwe. I'm the head of the National Advocacy and Technical Support Unit at the Global Survivors Fund. And I can see myself as one of this team. I will share some thoughts of my own as well. But essentially, I think before we get to introducing this group, I just want to have some introductory kind of notes. The field of transitional justice, as I understand it, was established, invented by practitioners. The reason why we have this field is because people out there said there's a gap in what survivors are experiencing in terms of transition processes. The demands of justice were formulated by people in the field. And since then, it has become adopted by academics, it has become adopted by international legal fraternity, and turned into something that practitioners often didn't recognize anymore. That practitioners now are reappropriating, are saying, this is where we need to, this is how we want to see it in practice. This is how we want to reconceptualize it. So that's what I'm hoping this conversation will be, is about reclaiming what practitioners see this field as encompassing. And we've got in very diverse perspectives here. Practitioners is a concept that we've got people here who come from survivor perspectives, from academic perspectives, from policymakers, and many of us here wear different hats and have transitioned from kind of different positions in this field and have been in it for many years. And I think there's also a sense of this isn't, as practitioners, this is a labor of love. This isn't a career, a job choice. This is an emergence from political activism, from personal experience. So it is deeply personal. And then it's on that basis that I want to start the introductions. To say, to ask practitioners, because I don't think it's useful to read their biographies. I think it's more useful to say, where do we come from when we talk here as practitioners? Firstly, myself, I'm South African. I grew up under apartheid. I was a student activist. So for me, getting into transitional justice was a natural progression of being an anti-apartheid activist. But it was also a form of a career development in academia. And then finding my academic kind of experience was relevant to activism for advocacy work. And so becoming a transitional justice activist in South Africa that then engaged more globally. And then in the last year and a half working with the Global Survivors Fund, where this is now a global advocacy role focusing on conflict-related sexual violence. So that's my evolution from where I think I've ended up shedding my scholarly academic background to be more of a direct practitioner and activist in this field. I'm going to ask the panel to introduce themselves. Vida, do you want to start?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I am Maria Lourdes Veneracion. I am from the Philippines. And the reason why I have actually been involved in transitional justice is primarily because of my involvement and engagement as the Senior Gender Advisor of the Transitional Justice and Reconciliation Commission for the Bangsamoro, that is in the Philippines. It was actually the first time that transitional justice as a concept was introduced in a peace process. In other peace processes in the Philippines, transitional justice was not actually heard of. It was probably primarily because of the internationals who are also involved in the peace process there in the Bangsamoro. This is the southern part of the Philippines. And one of the things that they wanted to actually ensure is that gender is going to be at the front, back, and center of the processes, as well as the report, as well as anything and everything that is going to be done by the commission itself. It was not a truth commission, but it was actually a commission that actually intended to study the historical injustice, the marginalization of land dispossession, the human rights violations, and legitimate grievances of a group of people, the Bangsamoro or the Muslim population in the Philippines. So that's the first hat that I'm wearing. The second hat is I am a university professor. And of course, as a university professor, it's always very important to bring whatever you have actually had experience in the field in the classroom. Because the best way to actually teach the students is essentially what's happening really on the ground. And because of this experience, I actually built up a project called Weaving Women's Voices. This is actually a memory project that included the components of research, that included also the Women's Summit, as well as training government implementers of transitional justice, and an exhibit that basically put together art. We're talking about art yesterday, and what is the role of art in transitional justice. So these two main areas that I have been involved in has been my trajectory, has been my positionality. And of course, not to forget, as also mentioned by my colleague Julissa last night, is that I'm also a feminist. So I think that is also something that we have to declare in any of our personal political projects. Thank you very much.
So, good afternoon everyone. My name is Petra. I'm from Cambodia. So, first of all, I would like to express my gratitude to Alka for inviting me all the way with a long flight from another part of the world. So, with my current work, I work as a program officer at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law in Cambodia. And my work related to, I work in the area of non-discrimination and inclusion, with focusing on the statelessness community in Cambodia, indigenous and transitional justice. So, prior my experience before joining the institution, I worked as a local peace expert at Toshan Genocide Museum, the museum that converted from the former prisons during the Khmer Rouge dictatorship. And my work there, I mostly focusing on building the knowledge of history education between the young generation of Cambodian. And it's also like my work also related to research and also documented the life story of the victims from the lands of their beloved one. Because at the museum, there is an archive that only document the biography of the prisoners, and they are like, they serve as evidence at the court, but from our perspective, we want to having the reconciliation and healing process for their families members. So from our perspective, we want to write a story, write their biography based on their family, rather than from the perspective of the perpetrator. So this is why my passion from working with the victims And also I used to involve with conducting like a survey nationwide with the victim participation with the judicial process of transitional justice, the EJPC, about how they perceive the justice from their point of view as a victim, as a direct civil party of the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, and also as the one who only a bystander, because at the court itself, like they only selected only the direct victims that they call under the jurisdiction of each case. So not everyone are entitled or having named as the victims under the court procedures. So this is all from me.
Je suis Dominique Kambala. Je viens de très loin, 7-8 km, la République démocratique du Congo, au centre de l'Afrique. Et je suis venu parce que je fais foi, je crois à la justice transitionnelle. Je voudrais vous remercier pour l'invitation. Et je suis praticien de la justice transitionnelle. Mon pays, la République démocratique du Congo, se trouve dans une situation de conflit armé dans sa partie est, la partie qui est agressée. Ça fait maintenant 30 ans qu'on ne sait pas ramener la paix. Et à cela s'ajoute qu'au centre du pays, là où je suis, au Kasaï, vous avez appris, l'humanité a appris l'assassinat odieux de Zaïda Katlan et Michael Schaap, les deux experts onusiens qui étaient venus enquêter sur les graves violations des droits de l'homme. D'ailleurs, le 12 ici, on a commémoré 7 ans de leur assassinat. Alors, je suis là en tant qu'avocat, engagé dans le processus de justice transitionnelle. En tant qu'avocat, je défends des causes, surtout qui concernent les victimes de crimes de guerre par meurtre et les victimes de crimes de guerre, crimes contre l'humanité par viol. Je défends à peu près 1200 victimes de violences sexuelles. Il y a quelques jugements qui sont déjà rendus dans ce domaine-là. Nous continuons à le faire parce que notre justice est confrontée à beaucoup de problématiques et beaucoup de défis. Et ça, c'est en tant qu'avocat. Donc, je m'occupe des victimes. Et d'ailleurs, une affaire est passée hier où je m'occupe encore de 232 victimes de violences sexuelles. Alors, je suis rapporteur de la commission provinciale Vérité et Réconciliation qui est en train de travailler pour établir la vérité, la lumière sur tout ce qui s'est passé. Et en tant que rapporteur, nous sommes en train d'élaborer les outils stratégiques de la mise en œuvre, les manuels des procédures, le règlement intérieur, les manuels spécifiques des procédures pour chaque sous-commission que nous avons, parce que nous avons la commission de justice, vérité, réconciliation, documentation et genre. Et je suis aussi responsable d'une structure, la Société congolaise pour l'état de droit. Nous avons travaillé aujourd'hui. Il y a au Congo le Fonds national de réparation des victimes qui a été mis en place. Et on est en train de travailler pour que ces victimes obtiennent réparation collective symbolique ou matérielle ou encore d'autres formes de réparation. On aura à en parler tout à l'heure. Voilà pour la présentation, je vous remercie.
Hello everybody, my name is Anas. I'm from Syria. I'm Syrian activist, human rights activist, and focusing on women and queer rights. I'm victim and slash survivors from the conflict in Syria, as my father was killed by the Syrian regime in 2012, and I was detained for 2 times and was subjected to many kinds of violations. Also, I work with Women Now for Development, which is the biggest Syrian feminist organization working in Syria and also in the neighboring countries. We support Syrian and girls on their basic needs and also with their advocacy to justice. And also we support some Syrian victims associations, and I will speak more about it later.
Buenas tardes a muy bienvenidas y bienvenidos a esta mesa redonda. Muchas gracias por la invitación. Yo soy Janet Rosentreter, me considero una defensora de derechos humanos, soy psicóloga. Mi activismo inició cuando en Chile se instauró una sangrienta dictadura militar, de la cual yo hice activamente resistencia, era muy joven, y posteriormente, ya recuperada la democracia, aunque hay una coincidencia en que no hubo condiciones de plena democracia en el inicio, mi activismo se ha ido dando en otros roles. Tengo formación en Derecho Internacional de los Derechos Humanos, en Psicología Clínica, y también he podido trabajar en algunas medidas de reparación que se originaron con la constitución de algunas comisiones de verdad y justicia o de reconocimiento de presión política y tortura una vez asumida la democracia. Fui jefa por 6 años de un programa que se llama PRICE, que es el programa de reparación y atención integral en salud y derechos humanos, un programa que se inició justamente para dar acceso a salud mental y física a las personas que habían sufrido violaciones a los derechos humanos, tanto de forma directa como familiares directos. Durante 6 años estuve en este rol. También me desempeñé más brevemente en el Instituto Nacional de Derechos Humanos, ¿cierto? Atendiendo a personas víctimas de violación a los derechos humanos, tanto en época de la dictadura como en democracia. Y tengo también formación en un protocolo de Estambul. El año 2022 publiqué un libro que aborda el tema de la tortura más allá, ¿cierto?, de lo que se conoció como casi una política pública durante la dictadura para, ¿cierto?, poder sofocar a aquellas personas que hacían resistencia, ¿cierto? Era un método de persecución política y por tanto se hizo muy necesario el reconocimiento de la tortura. Sin embargo, durante democracia esto no tiene la misma fuerza y el mismo impacto. Entonces parecía necesario investigar cuál era la condición de la tortura en Chile, pero durante democracia. Y también pude publicar un capítulo respecto a las secuelas de la tortura a 50 años de la dictadura en Chile, de lo cual cada vez hay más evidencias, ¿cierto?, amplias respecto de las enormes secuelas y los enormes daños que esto ha generado. Y pude colaborar con un capítulo para un equipo mexicano, y es un texto que se publicó por una editorial española. Más recientemente ahora hago apoyo a organizaciones de derechos humanos, particularmente cuando solicitan colaboración para formación, capacitaciones, y también me desempeño como perito en tribunales en causas de derechos humanos. Finalmente hago docencia. Esto sí lo destaco porque en general las universidades en Chile no tienen formación en derechos humanos, no se entrega a veces ni siquiera en pregrado para las carreras de derecho, menos aún para las de psicología, y por lo mismo es una propuesta para hacer formación de pregrado en derechos humanos. Así que hago 3 asignaturas del área de los derechos humanos. Muchas gracias.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Yo soy Mónica Mazariegos Rodas, soy de Guatemala. También quiero comenzar agradeciendo esta invitación a Tine, a Elke, a Gretel y al grandioso equipo de Justice Visions por esta posibilidad de aprendizaje mutuo y de intercambio que estamos teniendo en estos días. Yo nací en Guatemala, que como ustedes escucharon desde ayer, es un país indígena en América Latina, o de mayoría de población indígena, que experimentó una guerra que duró alrededor de 36 años. El dato más significativo sea quizás el dato más horroroso, porque en En mi país se vivió una historia de genocidio contra los pueblos mayas durante los años 80. En 1996 se firmó la paz y esto ocurrió tan solo 10 años después de que transitamos a la democracia. Entonces, en Guatemala la democracia tiene este doble sentido, ¿no? La transición, mejor dicho, tiene este doble sentido de democracia y de paz. Yo crecí durante la guerra sin saber que existía, que estaba ocurriendo esta tragedia, y es cuando entro a la universidad, cuando se firma la paz, que me entero, digamos, de todo esto que se estaba viviendo, y a partir de ahí, yo soy una académica a quien de alguna manera el interés cognitivo le surge en este momento, y que tiene que ver con la justicia transicional y con este proceso que a mí me interesaba, digamos, conocer y descubrir más. Digamos que entonces provengo de esa generación de la firma de la paz y por lo tanto, digamos que toda la vocación profesional y humana para mí viene de esta historia, de la transición en Guatemala. Por lo tanto, llevo 25 años más o menos de hacer investigación, de trabajar en el activismo, combinando a veces las dos cosas, a veces una sola de las dos cosas. He trabajado en organizaciones nacionales, en organizaciones internacionales, y actualmente trabajo en la universidad. Ahí también soy docente como tú, soy abogada como tú, estudié Derecho también. Doy cursos de derechos humanos, de género, derechos de los pueblos indígenas, justicia transicional, y también por ahí se mueve más o menos la investigación que llevo a cabo. He trabajado también durante más o menos 8 años dando clases en Colombia y haciendo investigación comparada sobre los procesos transicionales en América Latina. Y además de eso, formo parte de un colectivo, hace unos 10 años que formo parte de este colectivo que organiza un festival de cine que se llama Memoria, Verdad, Justicia, que arranca todos los años en la ciudad capital y sigue una ruta por las áreas rurales del país. Y entonces trato de combinar todas aquellas enseñanzas y aquellos relatos que escucho en los foros, porque después de las proyecciones de las películas siempre organizamos plenarias y foros con las comunidades, generalmente comunidades que fueron duramente golpeadas por la guerra. Y en este recorrido yo he aprendido que la memoria es un ejercicio infinito, digamos, ¿no? Es un movimiento perpetuo, y de ahí es donde nutro la mayor parte de los contenidos que pongo al centro de mi trabajo académico, porque creo que ahí comparto mucho lo que tú decías, ¿no? Es en la práctica, en la praxis, donde se puede nutrir el trabajo académico que hacemos.
Thank you so much. I think we've already illustrated the rich diversity and overlaps, and I think a sense that we have people here who can engage very comfortably with academic discussions while giving a very particular and a different and a challenging perspective. I think to kind of also just start framing who we have here, I think we've got, and I kind of engaged with people beforehand and see the diversity of engagement with different stages of the transition process. And I think there's a sense that transitional justice happens kind of at the end of a transition, but very clearly we've got perspectives here that extend through that whole period. And I think just to start us off and us to talk to us about in working in a context where there hasn't been a transition yet, where there's an anticipation of what needs to happen, where the focus is on issues of timing and what needs to be in place in terms of capacity and so on.
Yeah. Let me talk briefly, I promise you briefly, about the Syrian context. Just to clarify that before in 2011, a revolution started by Syrians against the Syrian regime, against the dictatorship. But because of the extremist violations that the Syrian regime faced these demonstrations, it became or changed from a revolution to an armed conflict, and now since 2014, unfortunately, it's identified by the as an international conflict, or national conflict, but involved by international actors. To be honest, the conflict, this is a main question that as Syrians we have been asking to ourselves, or to questioning ourselves, what's the time of the transitional justice? Should we wait? Usually the transitional justice period starts when the conflict ends. But should we wait until the conflict ends or not? Should we prepare ourselves and others or not? But I will explain through like a personal example. In 2014, I was invited by an international organization from Syria to go to Turkey to attend a workshop about transitional justice. At that time, I wasn't involved with the Syrian civil society organizations. I was a participant, and they gave us some information about transitional justice as one standard program that should be everywhere. At that time, I wasn't familiar, and I didn't accept this kind of process because it doesn't fit to the Syrian context. Later on, I worked with many different Syrian organizations, civil society organizations, and recently with Women Now for 10 years. And we discussed internally, I mean with my team, if we want to work on transitional justice or not. But we kept this answer until we know from people, especially women that we work with, and the discussions of women that we work on their basic needs through empowerment courses or protection activities. They were speaking about transitional justice, but from their own perspective, that how they see the daily justice. What do they need from the next period of Syria? At that time, we worked with women of disappearance in Syria, and they gave us their vision of justice. Then we decided to work with these women on their vision of transitional justice. And I was involved to start knowing about transitional justice, and then give this training to others, but not like one standard. We share case studies of different countries that they implemented or created their own process of transitional justice. Then we discussed this case studies with women and with girls and with people that we work with. And then I think between 2016 and 2020, some victims and survivors associations started working and establishing in Syria. And here we didn't work on or pushed people to organize as victims association, but when they started working or identify themselves as victims associations here, now we have a role to help them by tools, by knowledge, by different experiences from other countries' experiences, and also by advocate for their vision of justice. I mean, Women Now for Development, not working on my organization. We don't work like other documentation or legal organizations that working on accountability or like form of justice. But we try to support this all the transitional justice path or efforts through intersectional transformative gender lens, to try to make all this process more gender sensitive and to amplify or echo the victims' voices, not to speaking with the international community that we have access more than the Victims Association with another discourse that not make sense or not like support their own discourse. Okay.
So it's going to be a challenge for us to limit this to 1.5 hours, but I think we will try and be disciplined.
But I think the introduction was very short.
Giving people credit for what they did in the introduction, subtracting excessive use of the introduction from your following remarks. I mean, this is exactly, I think the question of how transitional justice gets defined from below, which is that questioning and the challenging of the norms that are imported. And I think there's a very strong language, there's a very strong agenda, and perhaps the delayed transitional justice is an opportunity to develop that global voice. I think next I'm turning to Dominique, where we're talking about a situation in the midst of a formal transitional justice, where there are state processes happening, and where it's an opportunity perhaps for civil society, for other, for survivors to make the most and to challenge and use these formal processes. If you can tell us a bit about that work and what those challenges involve, Dominique.
Voilà, merci beaucoup pour la question. En ce qui concerne le contexte, je l'ai déjà dit, la République démocratique du Congo a plusieurs éléments en termes de passé douloureux. Alors moi, je vais seulement parler de la spécificité de la justice transitionnelle dans le cadre d'une région. D'où je viens, c'est la région du Kasaï, au centre de la RDC. Et il y a eu un conflit armé qui a provoqué des graves violations de droits de l'homme. Alors là, nous sommes en train de travailler sur deux mécanismes officiels. Il y a d'abord le mécanisme de recherche de la vérité. Je suis rapporteur de la commission provinciale qui est chargée d'établir la lumière sur tout ce qui s'est passé dans le Kasaï. Et nous avons d'abord commencé par faire un rapport sur les consultations, parce qu'il faut consulter les populations. On a fait des rapports de consultation. Après, il y a eu le Parlement provincial qui a décidé de mettre en place cette commission. Après, on a sélectionné 12 commissaires et les commissaires ont arrivé à pouvoir mettre en place leur bureau, dont je suis rapporteur. Et là, nous sommes en train de travailler sur deux phases. Il y a d'abord la phase préparatoire qui consiste à définir les approches, parce que nous avons choisi une approche holistique de la justice transitionnelle qui comporte les 4 piliers: le droit à la vérité, le droit à la justice, le droit à la réparation et les garanties de non-répétition. Alors donc là, il y a la commission qui travaille sur le pilier de la vérité. Et nous sommes en train de renforcer les capacités des commissaires. Nous sommes en train d'élaborer les outils de gestion de la justice transitionnelle au niveau de la région du Kasaï. Et le processus continue parce que la commission est mise en place pour 2 ans. Nous avons déjà consommé 1 année. Nous avons entamé la 2e année de la mise en place de cette commission pour travailler pour la vérité. Alors, nous avons aussi un mécanisme de réparation. Le gouvernement national a mis en place un fonds de réparation des victimes de violences sexuelles liées au conflit et autres crimes contre la paix et la sécurité de l'humanité. Alors le rôle en tant que praticien, c'est de mener des plaidoyers pour que la justice transitionnelle, qui est confrontée à beaucoup de défis, soit mise en œuvre. Il y a beaucoup de défis, il y a des moyens qu'il faut mettre en place, il faut sensibiliser les populations, il faut former, il faut informer. Et ça, c'est le rôle que nous sommes en train de jouer pour que cette justice transitionnelle soit comprise, soit intégrée dans l'opinion des populations et accompagner utilement les processus à travers toutes les actions que j'ai définies, notamment en ce qui concerne le volet, je vais terminer par là, le volet de justice. La justice au Congo est confrontée à beaucoup de défis. Il y a un nombre limité de magistrats. Il n'y a pas beaucoup de moyens. Il n'y a pas une expertise médicale. En ce qui concerne l'exhumation des cadavres, les femmes qui ont été violées pendant 3 ans, comment on peut arriver à faire une expertise? Alors nous sommes en train de mener des plaidoyers pour que le fonctionnement de la justice au Congo soit efficace, parce que si on n'a pas une justice indépendante, on a une justice qui n'a pas de moyens, on a une justice qui est corrompue. Comment on va arriver à donner une réponse judiciaire à toutes ces victimes? Donc on mène des plaidoyers pour que la voix soit entendue. Au besoin, si la justice congolaise n'est pas efficace, est-ce qu'il y a possibilité de mettre en place une formule qu'on a utilisée l'autre fois, un tribunal spécial pour la RDC, pour lutter contre l'impunité, où il faut créer un tribunal mixte? Donc voilà, en tant que praticien, nous sommes en train de fonctionner sur les activités de plaidoyer, sur l'activité de sensibilisation, les activités d'information et surtout de formation des populations, parce que les populations sont ignorantes. Donc il faut les former pour qu'on comprenne la justice transitionnelle et pour que cette justice soit effectivement mise en œuvre. Voilà ce que je peux dire pour le premier tour d'État.
Thank you very much, Dominique. I think that reminds us, and I think the rest of us also are familiar with that process of the formal processes that essentially would not work were it not for the active engagement of civil society, where we work in context where the state capacity is so limited, and if we were to just observe these processes without engaging, they would fail dismally. So I think a lot of the credit for even what's happening at a formal level that we do kind of take on board ourselves. I want to then turn to Petra, and I think just kind of at the end of a formal process, it seems, where there's a sense of, it's only taken us so far. What kind of does civil society do in the wake of a formal justice mechanism, and where there's a certain sense of kind of so much that hasn't been achieved? Where does one start? What are the challenges that you face? And given that you had a long introduction that you already reflected, please keep it short.
Yes. Thank you. So I would say that as practitioners in the context of Cambodia, when there is a famous hybrid tribunal that happening for almost 20 years, I would say that right now the TJ process has becoming winding down, because after 2022, the court hand over the final judgment that the only alive perpetrator received a life imprisonment for the war crimes, crimes against genocide, and crimes against humanity. And I think for now to prioritize tasks for us as a practitioner in Cambodia, we no longer focus on the judicial process, because I would say, like Dominic already added, that in other countries, the practice is when they establish a transitional justice, they inform the victims how it looked like, how they should prepare, how the judicial system look like. And imagine that they already signed an agreement in 1997, and then the court established like in 2006. And during the country that, like for Cambodia, is underdeveloping country at that time. So the victims not really understand how the hybrid court look like, because we don't even understand how the national law or the national court process. So like it's more for us, it's the victim who's involved with the court process. They think that yeah, partly they receive the justice because their voice has been heard at the court, because they got the chance to give the testimony at the court, because their family's member were killed under the crime that the court had a jurisdiction over, like the case 001, the victims who lost a family member at the prisons. And then the case 002/1 and /2, they talk about the forced mobilization of the population. But how about the other victims who did not involve in the court process? What did the TJ do? So I think now the court proceeding done. So I think as the practitioner, we should focus more on the truth seeking, because this is one thing that I found is absent during the TJ process in Cambodia, where even after all the judgment, after the spending millions of dollars on the TJ process, people still have questioning like, why did such a thing happen in our country? How it happened? Because even as a young generation, we don't know like how. Even the court couldn't like give us the answer, because they only like can trial the perpetrator, and you know the perpetrator is not really bad culprit in the court anyway. They don't even set something against like they just like they are innocent, because this is how the politics look like. So and after they like slowly die one by one, so it become less interesting for the young generation. So I think it's important that we should document the individual story of those who are the victims, because I think it's important that we should have the collective memory of what happened during the past, because it's a national-wide mass violence. It's not only happened in a specific crime site that covered by the court. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thanks. And I think that takes us, the issue of documentation, the issue of a collective memory takes us, I think, into another issue that I think is very kind of close to the heart of, in a number of our panelists. I'll start with Monica, just to reflect a little bit on the work around memorialization in a context where it's a struggle to keep memory alive, to make memory relevant for present context.
Ya, gracias, Hugo. Sí, yo considero que en los procesos de justicia transicional que tienen una larga duración, uno de los retos, o quizás el reto más importante del trabajo de memorialización, consiste en desestabilizar esa especie de frontera de tiempo que se construye muy rígidamente entre el pasado y el presente, y tratar de construir esos puentes, digamos, ¿no? A partir de una reflexión crítica que nos permita volver siempre a aquella historia que dio origen al racismo, a la guerra o a la violencia política, según de lo que hablemos, ¿no? Creo que entendiendo y recordando ese vínculo entre el pasado y el presente, ese movimiento de víctima a agencia, como tú decías ayer, Tine, o de víctima a protagonista, como Rosalina también proponía anoche, es mucho más fluido y es mucho más posible, porque encontrando la historia, digamos, de las causas de la guerra o de la violencia política, encontramos la historia de las resistencias de las víctimas, que es aquello que dota por completo a esa agencia política que a veces queda invisible, ¿no? Yo creo que en el trabajo de la academia yo encontraría tres elementos que son bien importantes de mantener vivos para este vínculo, ¿no? Entre el pasado y el presente en el trabajo de la memorialización. Y es porque muchas veces los memoriales se quedan congelados en esa frontera del tiempo del pasado. Entonces, para evitar eso, creo que lo primero que es importante es mantener, ¿sí? ¿Mejor? Ok, perdón. Es mantener vivo el debate público, el debate de lo político, mejor dicho, desde la memoria histórica, para mantener siempre este enfoque de pensamiento crítico, ¿no? en el entendimiento de la realidad, y también para confrontar estos relatos, digamos, hegemónicos de los medios de comunicación, que por lo general son revisionistas o son negacionistas. Lo segundo que me parece importante es establecer todo el tiempo esos vínculos que no son siempre evidentes entre el pasado y el presente en el análisis que hagamos de la realidad, ¿no? estudio de casos sobre violaciones a los derechos humanos, es importante analizar, por ejemplo, la violencia de género a partir de la historia que tenemos, analizar, por ejemplo, la racialización de la violencia del Estado a partir también de la historia de violencia política o de la guerra, etc. Y en tercer lugar, creo que es bien importante mantener siempre este debate y sobre todo la conciencia de la agencia política de seres humanos que más que víctimas han sido protagonistas de procesos de resistencia de larga duración, de procesos de resistencia territorial, sociocultural, que obviamente se oponen a todas las lógicas patriarcales, coloniales y de desigualdad, ¿verdad?, que predominan en sus contextos, y que son personas que están mucho más allá de la etiqueta de víctimas, ¿verdad?, de la guerra o del genocidio. Creo que esas tres, elementos, estos tres retos son súper importantes de recuperar en el trabajo académico, que es donde yo me muevo, en el trabajo académico y de memoria en lo público.
Thank you. I think this is something that speaks to all of us, and I think Ed has got a particular, concern in terms of her context and the question of how past violations have linkages to what is presently happening in the country, in the sense that the past isn't in the past.
Thank you very much. One of the things that we have to remember is that when we're talking about transitional justice, there is really a clear transition. In the Philippines, there is no clear transition. There has been an authoritarian regime. The father of our current president right now in the Philippines was actually the one responsible for the atrocities that were actually committed in the past. So we have President Marcos Sr. committing these atrocities, and we have the current president, President Marcos Jr. So how can you actually have that kind of transitional justice if you have the same line that actually committed the atrocities in the first place? So the answer is grassroots memorialization, and this is something that I have actually experienced myself. When there are reparations that did not go the right way, or when there are acknowledgements or apologies that did not actually materialize, it is memory that has become very natural. Memory is natural in the sense of people who actually experience a particular thing. And I'll give an example. This is a story of a massacre that happened in 1974 in the area of the southern Muslim Mindanao that I was talking to you about. No one has actually recognized it until 2019. And it was because of the grassroots, efforts of women who said that we have to be recognized. The community experienced the same atrocity, and yet the reparation did not give the whole community reparation. So in that sense, they were asking, how come that there is no acknowledgement that the reparation has been, discriminatory, and so on and so forth. So our project essentially asks the women, so what do you actually want in terms of memorializing what actually happened? And they said simply, we want the names of our dead to actually be engraved in stone. And so that one day, people who actually come to see their gravestones essentially would recognize that these were the ones who died. And that was exactly what we did. We had the names of those who perished in the massacre in 1974 engraved in gravestone. And one of the things that we are also planning to do, or at least me, is to bring these gravestones home. We're planning to have these gravestones back in the community, and the community would be the ones to actually establish or create the infrastructure for which they would converge these names that have been there, that has finally given them recognition.
Thank you so much. I think final question then about the present context. I think there's in many of these places where none of us, I think, feel there's been a full transition, there's a full democracy, a culture of human rights. So there's always the question of how transitional justice speaks to broader injustices, structural violence, and so on. So what is the present challenges of how we make those kind of links for transitional justice? Got some thoughts on this?
Bueno, en Chile vivimos una dictadura militar que se desarrolló entre 1973 y 1990. Fueron 17 años que dejaron una marca profundísima en la sociedad chilena, cual no se ha restablecido hasta ahora, ¿cierto? El trauma que esa situación dejó. El proceso de justicia transicional en Chile comenzó una vez iniciada la democracia en 1990 y se formaron diversas comisiones que reconocieron los casos inicialmente de personas detenidas, desaparecidas y ejecutadas políticas y posteriormente otras condiciones de violación a los derechos humanos como prisión política y tortura de manera muy posterior, 10 años después, 20 años después, 24 años después, de manera muy tardía. Entonces, bueno, todo ese proceso de justicia transicional que en el caso de Chile ha sido muy extenso. En la actualidad tenemos 34 años de este proceso que sigue abierto, que sigue vigente, que sigue vivo. Si bien es cierto que no hay reconocimiento de nuevas víctimas o sobrevivientes, sin embargo, muchas personas están accediendo a los distintos ámbitos de reparación que el Estado desarrolló, como era la reparación en salud, la reparación económica, la exención del servicio militar, el acceso preferencial a vivienda a través de un puntaje, no se le da la vivienda, y muchos otros. Entonces, el hecho de tener un proceso de justicia transicional tan extenso pone muchos desafíos en relación a mantener la sensibilidad respecto a los profundos dolores y traumas que esto dejó. Se han acreditado estas situaciones como un trauma que no es ya de carácter individual, sino que es un trauma psicosocial, ¿cierto? Y por lo demás, cuando el proceso es de tan larga data, empieza a existir una relación con otros traumas y tú hablas del trauma acumulativo. Y eso ha sido un desafío muy grande porque tiene retraumatizaciones de personas que ya han sido traumatizadas por el Estado. Entonces, esto ha puesto en perspectiva, ¿cierto?, el hecho de que no podemos solamente como defensoras y defensores de derechos humanos quedarnos en el hecho de que las violaciones a los derechos humanos tienen un carácter de tales cuando se cometieron en el periodo de la dictadura militar, sino que el desafío como defensoras y defensores es plantear que las violaciones de los derechos humanos van más allá de las violaciones masivas y sistemáticas ocurridas durante la dictadura militar, porque solo puede propiciarse, ¿cierto?, tales vulneraciones cuando tienes condiciones estructurales de violencia que así lo permiten. Y por tanto el desafío es visibilizar esto en la sociedad, esta naturalización de la violencia. Y esto ha permitido justamente que se abran a nuevos temas y en donde la labor de defensora y defensora de derechos humanos principalmente creo ha estado en desarrollar el tema de la educación en derechos humanos a través de una pedagogía en derechos humanos que permita dar una mirada, ¿cierto?, y un enfoque integral que permita incorporar el enfoque de derechos humanos a todo el quehacer, ¿cierto?, de la institucionalidad pública, pero también de las organizaciones de la sociedad civil, quienes finalmente han sido quienes han mantenido vivo este desafío, ¿cierto?, de luchar por un verdadero reconocimiento, por la continuidad de la justicia, ya que se considera que siempre, a pesar de que han existido medidas de reparación, son muy limitadas, ¿cierto?, y no dan cuenta del profundo trauma que las personas y la sociedad en general vivió.
Thank you so much. I think we're going to go a bit off script. We're running a bit short of time, so I'm going to jump to Monica. I think what we're wanting to engage with more directly is how do practitioners' perspectives challenge or question what is normally expected and what is internationally expected, what academics are saying should be done in terms of transitional justice. Where do us as practitioners go off script? Where do we say, actually, we're going to do this differently? We want to, we have experiences, we are in touch with community needs. And I think it particularly reflect on the questions of the reforms that need to happen, the judicial processes, and the time frame, the scope of what needs to be addressed.
Sí, gracias, Hugo. Es interesante pensar justo en esto de los aprendizajes a partir de los procesos formales de justicia transicional. En el caso de Guatemala, que es el contexto del que yo vengo, estos procesos se han llevado décadas enteras, han sido larguísimos, más de 10 años básicamente para llegar a la primera sentencia por genocidio, por ejemplo. Solo este proceso se llevó 12 años. Entonces, digamos que lamentablemente los procesos formales no han podido como tales ser una inspiración para reformas institucionales más duraderas, ¿no? Desde luego que todas las sentencias que existen y que muchas personas aquí presentes han estudiado y están trabajando en sus diversas investigaciones son importantísimas en términos de precedente y de inspiración para la praxis o para, digamos, esta idea más de comunidad de práctica, ¿no?, en el derecho, más allá de la reforma institucional formal. Y más bien, yo diría, en Guatemala, lamentablemente, en las últimas décadas se ha vivido o se ha demostrado un proceso de cooptación del sistema de justicia que ha obligado al exilio de muchos operadores de justicia que actuaron de forma independiente, conociendo casos de alto impacto que iban desde la justicia transicional hasta los casos de gran corrupción. Sin embargo, creo que sí es posible encontrar algunas, pensando un poco prospectivamente y en lecciones aprendidas, a pesar de que no haya reformas institucionales concretas heredadas de esta justicia transicional formal, digamos. Creo que sí hay, proyectando hacia la arena social, varias lecciones. En primer lugar, creo que es posible sostener que desde la sentencia del caso genocidio hasta hoy, que ha transcurrido más o menos una década, hay procesos nuevos de defensas territoriales, de defensas por la democracia, de lucha contra la corrupción o lucha contra la cooptación del Estado, que son protagonizados pues por las viejas generaciones, digamos, de activistas, pero también por nuevas olas de jóvenes que en 2013, por ejemplo, adquirieron una conciencia política y social escuchando los testimonios del juicio por genocidio. Y estas generaciones de jóvenes que hoy votan, que hoy se expresan en las calles, también vienen de este proceso transicional, digamos, ¿no?, de más largo aliento. Número 2, creo que a partir de estas mismas reflexiones de los juicios por genocidio o las reflexiones sobre la violencia sexual como arma de guerra, por ejemplo, a partir de todos estos debates, también es posible encontrar a nivel de la sociedad esta crítica de las continuidades, por ejemplo, de las violencias de género o de la racialización de la violencia por parte del Estado, digamos, la arbitrariedad, ¿no?, muchas veces en el ejercicio policial, vinculado a las continuidades que vienen desde la guerra, ¿no?, de patrones de violencia durante la guerra, y eso me parece sumamente importante. Y en tercer lugar, a mí me parece que quizás uno de los aprendizajes más importantes sea el de las rupturas epistémicas, ¿no? Por aquello, digamos, pensando un poco en que no todo se puede traducir con un par de audífonos, ¿no? Los lenguajes y los mundos culturales son conjuntos de símbolos a veces, digamos, indescifrables o no tan fácilmente descifrables. ¿Qué quiero decir? Hay una dimensión de la justicia transicional que podríamos pensar algo así como el making of de una película, cuando el proceso penal es una especie de performance. ¿Qué pasa detrás de ese proceso, ¿no? ¿Qué nos ha enseñado en Guatemala estos casos de la justicia transicional? Pues nos han enseñado que si bien las sentencias son muy importantes, todo el proceso de llegar a una sentencia puede tener también allí elementos cuestionables, ¿no? Los significados de la reparación, los significados de la justicia en sí misma, los significados del desarrollo o de la felicidad en últimas, ¿no? Que pueden ser tan diversos entre un sistema de conocimientos y otro. Quiero decir que la mayor parte de personas que han sido víctimas en juicio, que han aportado testimonios a los informes de la verdad o que han participado en programas de reparación material e inmaterial pertenecen al pueblo maya. Y desde luego, toda su base cosmogónica para entender el mundo, la realidad, un proceso de justicia es diferente, ¿no? A la constitución, a las leyes, al proceso penal, que están pues obviamente basados o que tienen una raigambre liberal occidental, pero que también tienen una raigambre de castigo, digamos, ¿no? El sistema penal, bueno, el derecho penal moderno, que es el que opera en Guatemala. Esta enseñanza creo que es una de las más importantes, pensando también en lecciones aprendidas y en el interés comparado de dialogar con otros países, porque en lo epistemológico está quizás el reto más importante para los procesos transicionales. Yo diría, no solo pensando el pluralismo jurídico como la justicia en sí misma, sino como un lente para interpretar el Estado como relación social y como conjunto de instituciones, ¿no?
Thank you so much. I think that also leads us into, I think, the question of where we're at in terms of transitional justice processes that are providing a foundation for what's to come. And I think in the DRC particularly, where there is a sense of you building a foundation, but you're also anticipating that this is kind of, that civil society is going to have to stay on top of this process for years to come. And I think just to, Dom, if you can briefly, I think we want to start pulling together some final thoughts. We have 20 minutes left. I want to urge our panelists to consider what you're leaving for the rest of us to work with. So, some final thoughts on the next phase that you anticipate.
Pour l'avenir, effectivement, nous sommes en plein processus, mais il y a des questions fondamentales, des réflexions à mener. La première, je la situe au niveau de la mise en œuvre des recommandations du rapport final. Parce qu'il est démontré que dans plusieurs commissions, les recommandations qui sont formulées par les commissions justice, vérité et réconciliation restent lettres mortes. Les pouvoirs publics peinent à appliquer, à mettre en œuvre les recommandations. Alors, à quoi servirait d'avoir mené un processus de justice transitionnelle si, à la fin, les recommandations en termes de programme de réparation, par exemple, ne sont pas mises en œuvre? Donc, la réflexion pour nous, c'est de travailler pour qu'à la fin de ce processus de vérité, on puisse mettre en œuvre les recommandations. D'où la nécessité de réfléchir sur le comité de suivi des recommandations. Ça, c'est la première chose. Il faut aussi travailler sur le réseautage des organismes de la société civile pour arriver à consolider la paix. Pour arriver non seulement à consolider la paix, mais aussi qu'on en arrive à inculquer dans les chefs de population la culture de la promotion du respect des droits de l'homme. Je pense que je peux me limiter à ce niveau-là parce que le temps est vraiment limité.
Thank you so much. That was a lot said in a very short time. Thank you. Next, I think to turn to Anas, and I think also to talk about And you mentioned in our communication about a two-track transitional justice. And I think that's kind of a very interesting question. We've talked about track 2 diplomacy, or we talk about track 2 transitional justice as well.
I believe in my experience and also my organization experience, change needs to work on 2 levels. Community levels and formal or official level, because there is an official transition justice mechanism without an active participation of people, especially victims, movement. This should I repeat? This will not work. And also, if there is a ready victims movement without an actual mechanism, formal mechanism, and also this case will not work. So we should work on the 2 levels and make sure that there is a link between the 2 levels. And in all this process, we should make sure that there is an active participation and leadership of the victims movements and associations. Because even if the civil society organizations members are mostly victims, but also they don't have the big picture or all details of victims' visions. So we have to make all this process inclusive as we can. And also, I want to speak more about the differences between the victims associations and the civil society organizations, because sometimes we mix between the roles of both of them, and we have to make sure that there is a space for both of them, and mostly for the victims associations. Because in the Syrian case, before 2011, it was not allowed or forbidden for any kind of political or civil work. After 2011, the Syrian elite, mostly who had access to education or to international community, get part of the community agency from the state, from the regime. But did or do they transfer this agency to the owners of people, owners of the causes, or not? Or they kept it to them? And this is not like a victim-centered approach, nor any kind of sharing power and agency. I will give an example of this from the Syrian case. In 2000, I think Habib can clarify if I did anything regarding that time. 5 Syrian victims associations sat together and they discussed their vision of justice and accountability and the truth. And they put their visions in a charter entitled Truth and Justice Charter. And they made it very clear. They put a short-term goals or visions and about right to know and the truth, and also a long-term vision of accountability to make sure that we want accountability and we want truth, but don't mix them together, because if the political actors from the Syrian regime or from the opposition still mix between accountability and the truth, nothing will happen. And after that, they advocated to their vision, and also they engaged and added more victims associations. And recently, last June 2022, the UN General Assembly issued a resolution to create an independent institution for missing people in Syria. So this is a very practical example about working on the 2 levels and make the link between the 2 levels.
Thank you so much. I think bringing us back to the victims and what their demands are is critical kind of sounding board for all of us. And I think on that note also to Petra and to look at, hear the question of in the opposite end of this, of once that some truth has been established, the next generation, how they're involved, and if you can, reflect on the role of the victims and survivors in that process.
Okay, so I will keep it short. So I would like to say that in my country, we should move from the previous, like the former transitional justice to the new one by engaging with the new generation, or I would say like young generation who never experienced the regime, because it's very important that there's always a stereotype or an assumption that the young generation who never experienced would forget about it and not interested in learning about the past, because they are not one. Like, they are not the direct victims or the direct consequence of that regime. But I think this is a wrong assumption, to be honest, because I'm one of them that I'm really interested about learning the past. I'm always passionate about learning about history and about the Khmer Rouge regime, because I think like this is very interesting for me. When I was young, that my parents, because they are also the kids during that time, and they always telling about how it's happened to them and comparing the life in the past and the current. And then there's one thing that we should take, like engaging the younger generation by not assumption that they're not interested, but engage them in a way that that to tackle their curiosity and to make them aware that this is what happening in the past. So in order to avoid this from happening again, because this is also one of the principles of TJ, is the principle of non-recurrence or the never again mentality for the future generation. I think to telling them and engage them in the TJ process by, I think more in a resonant way is to like it's starting from the formal education, because I think in our formal education the chapter that talking about the history is very short, and also even the court itself is not really good at publicize about what's happening at the court and to gathering the information and the jurisprudence. Even as a law student myself, I also don't really know what really happened at the court unless I'm working in that field, and then I know this is happening, this is how, the outsider know better about the transitional justice in my country than the one who living inside that country. So I think this is important to engage the young generation and also engage the victims to raising awareness starting from their community that about what's happening to them, and to telling their own families members, like this is a consequence of the war, so how to keep the country in peace, and also not to what to say? It's just like not to tolerate with the impunity, because I would say that the reputation of Cambodia about democracy, I think you all know that how this happened in our country. I think even in the Philippines about the Marcos Jr. become the president, and I think now it's even in my country, like my former prime minister, he is the longest serving prime minister in the world, I would say, and now they hand the power to his son. So I think it's just like, so I leave it to you to think about it. So that's it.
Thank you so much. I think just to bring us back, and I think kind of some of the last reflections from both Vina and Jeanette, to look at what are kind of many years later, after kind of so much has been done, what is it that still needs to be done with the survivors? What are the needs that we need to still address practically on a day-to-day basis?
Well, I think, the role of survivors has to be defined by the survivors themselves. I mean, it's not something that, we could provide the training, we could provide, for example, the language of transitional justice, but they themselves have already been practicing transitional justice. It's just that they haven't called it transitional justice. When they're actually trying to advance, for example, the acknowledgement of a particular atrocity event in their community, in the idea of how do they actually memorialize as well, how the things that have actually happened to them, what would now be the role, for example, of reparation? Do they really need reparation compensation, or do they need actually public apology? When we had the experience of putting the Victims Summit in 2019, it was a civil society strategy to bring victim communities together. They did not know what it was meant to be called the victim community. And in that sense, that it was something that they themselves actually defined. So in other words, just to pick up from what Anas has actually said, civil society and victim community are linked, but they are different in terms of what they actually are doing. But there has to be that kind of collaboration, a hand-holding kind of relationship. There has to be that engagement so that each would essentially build on the strength of each other. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think then some final words from Jeanette regarding, I think, context where a lot of other countries look at in Chile as almost what should be done, what other people feel hasn't, kind of provides an example of what could be done. But even in that context, so many years later, there are many unresolved issues, and I think issues of intergenerational dynamics that we're not taking seriously. If you can tell us more about that.
Sí, efectivamente en Chile, a pesar de que son muchas las acciones de reparación que se han podido poner en práctica en estas décadas, desde dentro, ¿cierto? Como señalaba, la profundidad del daño es tanta que todo parece insuficiente, porque no cabe duda que hay situaciones de tal gravedad que son absolutamente irreparables, o sea, no hay medidas posibles de reparación para ello, y eso es importante siempre reconocerlo. Y con el tiempo eso cada vez se ha visibilizado más. Uno de los temas que creo que tienen un menor desarrollo es el tema del reconocimiento del daño transgeneracional, ¿cierto? Inicialmente nunca se habló de que el daño excediera a la misma persona afectada o a un familiar muy directo que componía el grupo familiar al momento de la vulneración a los derechos humanos. Pero ya unos 15 años después, un documento público reconocía la existencia del daño transgeneracional como una de las condiciones que debía tenerse en cuenta para las reparaciones. Sin embargo, más allá de este reconocimiento declarativo, ha sido muy difícil considerar que el daño transgeneracional pueda tener una respuesta como la que se necesita para ese reconocimiento, ya que esto ya habla de segundas, terceras generaciones, ¿cierto? Hijas, hijos, nietos y nietas, que también muestran secuelas de los eventos traumáticos, pero que no están dimensionadas como corresponde, aún estando en estos instrumentos. Y por lo mismo este es un tema muy importante que han abordado algunas personas que trabajan en ONGs o que hacen docencia, en relación a que el tema del daño transgeneracional debe tenerse siempre en cuenta y visibilizarse muy bien, porque no es un tema del presente, o sea, primero ya no es del pasado, no es del presente, y es un tema del futuro, porque la relación que se ha establecido con las personas, con las víctimas, con los sobrevivientes, con las organizaciones de la sociedad civil, con el Estado, bueno, es una relación que surgió desde la profunda desconfianza, porque hubieron estas vulneraciones. En Chile, en el año 2019, tuvimos un proceso de estallido social donde hubieron masivas violaciones a los derechos humanos, es decir, fue la primera situación grave de violación a los derechos humanos después de la dictadura, y eso reflotó muchos de estos traumas, y por cierto el tema del trauma acumulativo, y muchas personas de segundas y terceras generaciones, incluso cuartas generaciones, hablaron de cómo de alguna forma llevaban esta bandera de lucha del reconocimiento y la debida reparación para sus familiares. Entonces ese es un tema que no está suficientemente abordado y donde aún hay muchos déficits.
Thank you so much. I think all of these inputs speak very much to my struggles, my experiences, my trying to understand both my context in South Africa, where our Truth Commission closed more than 20 years ago, and we are still organizing, mobilizing to reopen the reparations process because it was so deeply insufficient. We are still contemplating legal challenges in reaching out to more survivors who weren't kind of addressed by a very brief, it was a 3-year process, kind of where the government tried to close the book on the past. And there's no closing that book. I think there's no measures that are ultimately kind of satisfy survivors. This is not just for the survivors, but the next generation. And that also is our experience when we deal with conflict-related sexual violence, where the experience there is we, as Global Survivors Fund, we work in countries where these violations happened perhaps 20 years ago. And we find people who suffered violations who are still as affected now as they were 20 years ago, and if not more so at times, because of this alienation that they suffer within their communities, because of the stigma that they haven't managed to overcome. And I think what is on an encouraging level is when we do engage and we provide comprehensive reparations, 20 years later you can still have a transformative effect on people. That this is a long-term battle because we know there's still so much that can be achieved, that there isn't a sense of kind of it's too late or people have gotten on with their lives, is what we're told by government. That kind of we have other priorities, it's too late to do anything now, it's never too late. We see in so many contexts where we feel we're inspired, we have hope because of what we see we can achieve through our work, even at this very late stage where some have died, but for those who are living, there's still so much that can be achieved. And I think that's the hope that we all kind of live by, that sustain us after many years in this field. We've reached the end of our session. I want to just see if I don't want to open it up for questions. I'm going to give anybody who wants 1 minute from the panel or from the audience who wants to make a 1-minute input or statement. And I'm going to just 3 people who, if there are any takers, because I don't want to hold you here any longer. You've been patient. One hand up already. Any other hands up? I don't want this one hand to inspire too many other people, so I'm very happy to leave the final word for tonight.
Bueno, agradecer todos los comentarios y los análisis e interpretaciones sobre el tema que nos reúne. Yo solo quiero tal vez agregar dentro de todo estas reflexiones el tema de que también todos los perpetradores se puede ir juzgando en el tiempo, porque a lo mejor todas las responsabilidades de tortura, de desaparición forzada, de masacres, de violaciones o violencia sexual contra las mujeres, contra la niñez, no se pueda juzgar en algún tiempo, pero la historia siempre tiene un juicio moral, un juicio de conciencia. Entonces es muy importante el integrar a esto los juicios de conciencia, porque de alguna manera hemos visto nosotros en Guatemala que no se puede tal vez juzgarlos por genocidio, pero se puede juzgar por usurpación de tierra, se puede juzgar por corrupción, se puede juzgar para que no quede en la impunidad. Entonces, es algo que yo quiero integrar a este análisis, ¿verdad? Y que sobre todo hay muchos otros casos que a lo mejor nunca se ha podido abordar, pero que es muy importante no quedarnos con el tema legal, sino también con todo lo político, lo económico, lo cultural. Y muy poco se puede abordar el tema cultural, porque de alguna manera esto no es, como dicen los abogados, no es tangible, o sea, no se puede ver dónde está, pero sí los daños morales que esto ocasiona, históricos, permanece. O sea, por ejemplo, el pueblo maya ha dicho, nuestros abuelos dicen que todos los daños psicológicos, morales, espirituales que se dan puede traspasar más de 13 generaciones. Eso lo hemos visto y lo hemos constatado, porque nosotros, aunque la invasión europea haya pasado 5 siglos, lo seguimos mencionando ahora. Es decir, que toda esa historia como que no tiene fin. Quiere decir que el compromiso también es pasado, es presente y es futuro. Gracias.
Thank you. I'm not going to say anything more.
Please, by all means, these last words be what you take with you as you leave this room. But I did want to take one more moment for those people who were not there yesterday to also thank the colleagues from Tunisia who were not able to make it here because of visa reasons. I explained this yesterday. But as my colleague Elke also mentioned, we really wanted to have their voices be part of this conversation. So for those who are interested, we just released the podcast with the colleagues from Tunisia, and it's you can listen to it in the exposition room, so that they are kind of here with us. I also want to underline that we're having this roundtable here now, but I should not only thank you for being here now as part of the roundtable, but also for the fact that for most of you, we have been part of roundtables that we have been organizing prior to this conference in each of the countries of the people that are here, plus Tunisia. And you have all been so very generous in helping us support in the facilitation of that, participating in it. So thank you also for that. Thank you for being here also. We've had relations with many of you for such a long time already, but to see you here in one room and to listen to you enjoy just in this conversation together is truly wonderful. Thank you so much for that.
Don't leave, please, sorry. Sorry, small announcement for the concert. So those of you who want to join the concert, Sira and Gustavo will be accompanying you at 7:30, waiting at the reception or outside here at the gate. Second important announcement, you have these body bags and I need to return them tomorrow in the morning. Can I kindly ask you to remove the earphones? You can keep them, consider it a present from Justice Visions. Are you not interested? Please leave them on the chair here. Please also switch off the device and put it in the suitcase there in the case. That would be lovely and would save us some time. Thanks so much.